Yeah.
maybe shouldn't be the primary mode of the church. I don't know exactly what you're
Yeah.
that whole conversation was.
Hmm.
I thought the most
Mm.
interesting from last week of maybe even Jesus wouldn't have preferred
Hmm.
the Bible to come with it as it did,
Hmm.
into Christianity as we know it.
Yeah. Well, that can I launch off from
Yeah.
that point? And it's right on the moment too. It's perfect timing and kind of I think an interesting place um, to start this conversation. Uh, because I do think that's sort of at the heart of it. One of the questions I've asked, like if we do have a tend to have a more immature or adolescent view of the Bible, and adults continue to hold that, and some other thing, it almost makes one wonder if there isn't a desire, if um, there isn't like almost this human need, at least of the last 5,000 years or so, in human civilization, to want to create something that plays this role that the Bible has, where there's some inarguable text that we can turn to solve disputes about humanity and God and the big questions. I actually think the narrative of Christianity is trying to work against that. I think the narratives that you see in the very Gospels that have been pulled into that kind of construct are actually trying to provide an alternative to that view. And it's trying to almost fight a it's almost trying to pull humanity into a new level of development from the idea that you're going to outsource your religious authority to a determined script or text. And we're going to talk about the Gospels tonight. We're going to talk about the letters of Paul tomorrow or next week. We'll do a bit with some of the pseudo letters of Paul after that, and then we'll do a little bit with the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament most often. Um, but especially the Gospels, I think, are really working hard. Specifically, in my view, the Gospel of John, which is one that I've spent a lot of time in recently, is really working hard to try to dislodge the the belief that a text is a static force that uh, humanity is supposed to continue to return to. The opening poem of the Gospel of John tries to sort of grab this whole idea about this living word and this word being spoken. And that word was the light, and that word was the life that fell upon all of humanity. And all of humanity was that there's this very flow kind of movement pulling that happens. And it's trying, I think, it's trying to present an alternative to a narrative of there is a text. I think the other gospels do this with Jesus saying, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." It's framing the Jesus Christian narrative in contrast to the written and interpreted process of first century Judaism. Now, I'm going to be very careful here, and I think we all need to be very careful in the world that we live in, and for the time that most of us are going to be alive, to not to be careful to not come anywhere near overstating some opposition of a Jesus agenda to Jewish people. That has not gone well in the 20th century and has been utilized as the rationale for the slaughtering of Jews and for the discrimination against Jews. So I'm very careful about that. So sometimes I get a little, you'll notice I get a little stuttery right around the time when I'm going to say something like that because I think it matters that we say it really carefully, and I don't always like to be careful in my construct. So I want to be careful about that. Having said that, right? So trying to be very careful about that. The Gospels do seem to set up Jesus in contrast to the first century Jewish religious system. I'm reminded by my rabbi Joseph Edelheit that the first century religious system is as foreign to modern day Jews as it would be to us. That is, there's not just a continuous line. That was a particular expression happening at a particular time. And I think that the Gospels are setting up a real, almost bright line. Somebody used that phrase a minute ago. Almost bright line choice about which way this thing can go. And there's this Jesus path that doesn't want to orient around texts. I think it's not accidental that Jesus is in the Gospels is never writing anything other than this one time when he bent down on the ground and wrote something in the dust. which if you really want to make a lot out of this argument, that's a really good one to return to. I'll do a little shtick on that in a minute. Jesus doesn't write things, and Jesus doesn't act like what he's saying needs to be captured and recorded. That's not the narrative. This thing we're doing right now, I'm working really hard to capture and record it, right? Because I want to I want to transmute it. Is that right? I want to send it out to lots of other people to listen to. I'm very intentionally doing something that it seems to me Jesus was not doing as Jesus is portrayed in the Gospels. He's not particularly concerned about everybody getting the words that he says just right or getting the narratives just right. The Gospels are not constructed that way. So I think anytime we're presented with that impulse to want to sort of return back to it and check the text to see if that gives us the right permission, we need to be careful on that. Now, I am someone who thinks that the stories that are told there are really informative. I think they're instructional. I think they're helpful. I think they're profitable for correction, for teaching, and for training in righteousness. I'd go so far, right? I think that's the way we should think about them. They're really useful, but they're not command and control. They're not the center. They weren't intended to be that way. And the impulse to turn them into that is really profound. A couple of things about the Gospels that I think matter. I think they were a great notion and a way to tell a narrative. I will suggest, and this is an inaccurate word, but it's just zippy enough to kind of grab your attention. The Gospels are designed as propaganda. Think about propaganda, the force of propaganda, which is to tell people that there's a truth in the world. Now, mostly, and maybe propaganda is not ever a could be done in a like a positive way to help people see the truth of something. I don't know the actual functional definition of the word propaganda, um, but it's a good way to think about the Gospels. If you start with, oh, this is a bunch of people trying to tell you something that they want you to come to a particular conclusion around. There is a really aggressive agenda in the Gospels, right? They're not passive. They're making an argument. They want to make a point. Uh, I'm doing that right now. Some of you know the way we do Christianity around here is much more conversational and sort of like, here's a viewpoint and here's a viewpoint. It could be a little something like this. And they probably have some truth, but it might be better if you think about, a little of this, a little of that kind of an approach. The Gospels aren't doing that. They are they are full throated arguments trying to make a particular point. So when we run into them, what you're running into is the opinionated aunt or uncle in the family, right? They're saying something and they're trying to it's all designed to elicit. They're designed to elicit a response. They're designed to elicit a reaction, an emotion. They're they're really trying to work it up, right? They're trying to do something to the reader. So they're not at all this like telling of the objective truth of God that was meant to be conveyed. And what we can do is just return to it. And when you find it, you will look in there and you will find the truth. They're not the ingredients on the back the of the package. They are the branding on the front of the package. Never tasted better. Looks great. Gluten free, right? They're trying to they're engaging all the time. So this idea that they're not high that it's some kind of like uh, static truth. They're not. There's nothing about them that feels that way, right? They're super like yeah. They're a Michael Moore film, right? You don't watch a Michael Moore film and be like, I bet that was a really balanced documentary. There's nothing balanced about that documentary. He's trying to make a point. He's trying to get you to come to a conclusion that he's decided ahead of time, right? They're not. It's not a documentary in that kind of way. The Gospels aren't a documentary in that sort of way. They're really pushing something. I think that is the adult way. Here's why I think that really matters. I think the adult approach to looking at the Bible or the Gospels are, okay, they've got a really strong opinion. Maybe I do too. So what we should bring to it is our pushback. I don't think I'd say it that way. What they're getting at there. It requires us to have to deal with the Gospels as if they are an agendaed, they're a friend with an agenda, and we have to decide how we're going to respond. They're not just sitting there. They're not. I don't think there's some deep metaphor that is designed for us to go into and explore and search around and find multiple meanings. I don't care if people. I think there's a big argument and debate about what point they're trying to make. I don't think that's always entirely clear as you get into the 20th and 21st century and how we understand language and what we think happened. But I think they're by design are trying to make a point. They're not neutral for us simply to come and put our that they're not just laying there as if now we have to sort of unveil what they're getting at. I think they're of a different kind, and I don't think there's much like it in the religious uh, in the religious library of other written texts. I think the Gospels are unique in that sense. um, they're not, you don't treat them like you do the other things. I really do think that it's wise for us to say you should know when you're in that book, in one of those books, and when the stuff you're talking about comes from those as opposed to comes from the other places. It's a bit like when if you stick around, we end up talking about the Hebrew scriptures. When you're in the book of Job, you should know that's a passage from Job. Or if you're in the Psalms, you should know this is a psalm and not like from the book of Chronicles or something. They function really differently. They're designed differently. You should sort of know what that category is. Well, that's the way the Gospels are. They're really aggressive in trying to make a point. So it doesn't leave the reader um, with um, as much space as one might want. And I think that's something that makes them the favorites of some people. That's why some people really love the Gospels, and other people are like, yeah, I don't know. It's it I think people get anxiety sometimes when they're hearing read long gospel sections because it just feels like it's coming at you so aggressively. You're just like, what now? What were they saying? And what were they doing? And why? And then they just shift and go on to this thing. It doesn't seem to sort of fit. So uh, there's a there's an offbeatness to the agenda that's happening in the Gospels. Two of them, you probably know, tell you from the author's um, or the communities, whether it was an author or a community, still forgot. I think all of them were written by communities of people, or curated at least by communities of people. That they're doing this very thing. The Gospel of John tells you at the end twice. The phrase is something like, "And many other things did Jesus do that are not recorded in this book, but these things are written so that you will believe that Jesus is the Christ, and by believing you'll have life in His name." Right? Like, yep, did a lot of other things. Some things not even telling you about. Cut some out, pretty obvious to me. Brought some things in. And why? Because wanted you to believe some things. And we think that that believing is going to produce something in you that will generate the kind of life that Jesus was talking about. There's a function to the design. It's supposed to do something in you. Uh, the Gospel of Luke does it at the beginning. Starts out with this dear Theophilus, which maybe it's a person, maybe it's a community. Many have undertaken to write an account of the things that have happened. We've written these things so that you will be sure. I can't remember how it goes. Somebody remember how it goes? That you will have confidence in the things that you've been told, or something like this. Right? Lots of other people said some things. We kind of looked around, kind of got the stuff together. Here's our take on it. Right? They're telling you right in there that there's an author or a person or a narrator with an agenda that wants something to happen. And yet there's this sense in the Christian tradition as if these things are some sort of removed static truth that just exists for all time. And as opposed to it's a really aggressive pitch. I happen to like it. I bought the pitch. Right. When Shelly and I went to Mexico this last week, we go to this resort and we use this club that we're in, this vacation club. One of the things they'll do at this places give you a bunch of things if you go to their pitch about their vacation clubs. So you can get like free breakfasts, and they give you a couple $100 worth of stuff. And if you've ever been to one of these vacation pitches, yeah, it's literally buying, swampland in Florida kinds of things, but they're condos. They want you to buy these things, and you go in. If you don't know that you're in a pitch, it can be really confusing. So how often do you vacation? How much money do you think you spend on your vacation? Like if you think people are just chit chatting with you over breakfast, they're not. It's all part of the presentation, right? And that's the deal. And they want you to know when you go to it, this is the deal. They don't want you to not know, because then if you get surprised, you're like, oh, I don't want to buy a vacation plan from you people. What am I doing here? They're like, oh, that's a waste of time. They want you to know. So you have to sign this little form at the beginning. I know what I'm getting into. Should almost be like with the Gospels. There should be a little thing at the front. I know what I'm getting into. The Gospel wants to make a point, and here it comes. That is, I think, foundational to understanding, um, as an adult in a mature way, what's going on here. That the Gospels are pitching, which is why I think the idea that some of us have been taught to bounce around and create a composite of a narrative of Jesus that comes from a little grab here and a little nibble over here and a little bit of influence here, creates a real distorted view. You end up with a Picasso like Jesus if you're pulling bits and pieces from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, let alone the other gospels that aren't included in the canonized set. You start pulling all those together and try to make one person out of all this. That's just near on impossible. There was probably some sort of a core document, which is, if you're into Bible words and stuff, you might remember this, about this source that Matthew and Mark probably used, and maybe some Luke. It's often called Q, and that has to do with a German phrase of this originating source. And so there's a belief from scholars, and they're probably right, that there was some sort of a writing that we don't have anymore, and that Matthew and Mark were utilizing that text in order to collect the stories of Jesus that have been cobbled together. And there was probably um, a process that went on over a number of years to get the gospels together from first person accounts and then interpretations and then so there's a whole process. All this comes together, which I think is really important. It's good to know. I agree. I think that's how it all came together. But that's not the thing we have. We're not dealing with some Q source. We're dealing with it after the brochure has been put together in a way that wants to bring you to a conclusion at the end. So the agenda nature of those, I think, requires us, as we think about our own spirituality and the use that the Gospels are going to have, is to have to be an evangelist yourself. So I think what the Gospels want to do and are designed to do is not to override the thoughts and wills and desire of people, but to become a part of the relational set that a person is in. So that the same way you might say, hey, we're going to go out with our friends tonight, and he's really into like sciencey stuff. So kind of get yourself ready for that nerdy science conversation that we're going to have. Or hey, we're going to go out with the Pagits, and it's going to turn political at some point. Like it's going to be, whether it's 15 seconds in or 35 seconds in, at some point Doug is going to try to say something about how there's a crisis in the community of the country of the United States, right? So just prepare yourself for that, right? That's going to happen. Not so that you would say, oh, I'm going to go, I can only believe what that person says. I have to believe, I have to buy it. Rather, you start to say, no, I'm going to have my own take on this and know what's coming. So I don't think the Gospels, just because they have an opinion, mean that someone who's in the faith has to hold those opinions. The Gospels are a construct of the people, no matter how you think they came about or when. They were put together by people who already held the faith of Jesus, and those people didn't need the Gospels in order to have the faith. Right. So again, much like last, with all the Bible, it is not a requirement; it is a product of. So what we've ended up with then is this content in the Gospels that are, really trying to do something, and they're trying to answer questions that most of us don't have. The agenda that they're on, the big project that the first, maybe second century community put together had when they put together these gospels, that's not the one any of us are holding. Our worldview is different. Our assumptions about the very faith that it's describing is different. The situation we find ourselves in is unlike theirs, and theirs unlike ours. So we're not only are we reading some propaganda that has an opinion that wants to have the reader draw a conclusion, we weren't even the intended audience by any in a lot of very meaningful ways. So there's an odd thing going on, right? I don't think we need to have gospels to be people of vibrant, healthy faith. I think we should be gospel writers. I think the reason the gospels are most functional for us is to compel all of us to have your own version of what you think the thing is that brings human thriving, that brings about life, that brings about um, uh, goodness in the world. How are people called together to live in a generative way to provide an alternative to the other stories of our world? That's what we ought to be doing. And the Gospels ought to compel us, propel us, prepare us to be able to do that. That we're in a great community of Gospels, our own plus these, and that's the storyline that we should be telling. So the fact that they have an agenda, super important. The fact that that's not our agenda is really important. It's not supposed to be. That's why there's four, right? This is the whole great thing about there being four gospels. If Mark or Q source was enough, then we just had Q or Mark. But we don't have Q or Mark. You also have Matthew. And then you've got Luke that comes in and is like, I know a bunch of other people tried this too, but here's a better take on it, right? And then quite a while later, I think, Gospel of John comes along and is like, okay, that set of stories, they don't work. Here's a new one. In the Gospel of John, and I'm super into this right now because this book I just finished is about this. The Gospel of John has 7 miracle stories. Uh, I really should have known this because I should put this in my book. I don't know how many are in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. A bunch, kind of random, and references all the time. And Jesus did a bunch of other things that we didn't really write here, right? Not in the Gospel of John. There are 7 in the Gospel of John. And they go in a particular order, I think, for a very particular reason. I think they're retelling a creation narrative. I don't think it's 7 by accident. I think it's 7 days of creation, and then there's an 8th day. And instead of resting on the 7th day, it's the rising of Lazarus on the 7th day in that storyline. I think they're doing a very particular thing that interacts with first century pagan imagination and with the retelling of the narrative of Genesis. So it's doing of the 7 stories of miracle signs that are in John. None of them are in the other gospels, Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or if there's something that looks like them, their conclusions and storyline, which are 2 of them, the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on water, have an almost different conclusion, a different conclusion almost to the point that you'd say, sort of a different storyline if it ends like that, right? So here's 7 stories in the Gospel of John, 5 of which aren't told in the other Gospels at all. One of them being the rising of Lazarus. So somehow, if you could imagine that there was this thing that happened once where Jesus went to his friend's tomb after he was dead for 4 days and said, Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus comes out and he says, take off the grave clothes, takes off the grave clothes and goes home. And then 3 days later, they have a party at his house and Lazarus is cooking the meal. That happens. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke all say, nah, let's not include that one. Let's not have that story be in the set. Like how that's not like the first story in all of them is its own level of unbelievable, right? So why is it not in there? Why is the blind man's story not in there when he makes the mud and puts it on the man's eyes? Why is the story at the pool not that way? Why is the healing of the Roman centurion's son not in there? Why is it told as a slave boy in the other ones and not as a son? Why does John do that? What's happening in the arc of the Gospels is if there's Q, then there's let's put Mark together, then maybe Matthew together. Then Luke comes in and says, "Hey, I need a version of this." Then a while later, the Gospel of John writers or curators are like, "Oh, we need a whole new set of stories here. Let's re-arc this thing. Let's have Jesus cleanse the temple as the first thing, not the last thing. Let's rearrange the order, come up with new stories. Go. And what the Christian church has kept around is that's the collection, is the set. Four different gospels, Matthew and Mark, that look an awful lot alike, but in some really different ways. Then Luke, then John. This is a progression that wasn't supposed to stop at John. I think that's the whole narrative of the Bible. That's the thing that compels the reader to become a disciple, to become an evangelist, to become a gospel writer, right? So the impulse of the early days of putting a collection of books of gospels together that become part of the Bible is totally the opposite of lock it down, close it up, and create a determined set of meanings that people go back to and imply in there. Right? So it's just not what I think it's not what the text lends itself toward. Some people might listen to this later, or you guys would go tell someone that you were in this thing and this guy was saying this deal, and they'll be like, "Oh, well, here's why that." I just think that the text itself. There might be a lot of reasons why people don't want a Bible that's constructed this way. I think that's totally fair. But the text itself and the history and the relationship of these four books, it's really troublemaking to the idea that we're supposed to have some sort of a closed system and process. Last couple minutes. Then you get to the actual content in the Gospels. And here we go again. The fact that the Gospels are the only places that hold the quotes of Jesus and the other writings, Paul's writings and the others, don't have any quotes of Jesus. Or if they do, they're really vague references. Did you ever think about that for a minute? Other than the book of Acts, just at the beginning, because it sort of continues. There is no in the letters that come in the sort of the set of books that become the rest of the Bible. There's no quoting Jesus in those. They don't go around and say, as Jesus said, in the one time where Paul says, as Jesus said, there's no record of Jesus having said that. It has to do with he calls the Lord's Supper. So there's this quote that's credited to Jesus, but whoops, not in the Gospels, which really sort of opens up the category. So the Gospels weren't used in the early days as some sort of a quote text. It wasn't the repository of the teachings. Look, I'm all about Jesus being a master teacher. I think he was a master teacher. I think we should approach Jesus as our master teacher. I think that's a great way to go and really helpful. And I think we should push Jesus as the master teacher of a way of humanity, and we should follow in that way. Yep. But the where we get those teachings is to extract them from outside of a set of gospels that we're trying to do something else. So the early church didn't organize itself, and the Bible is not a collection of Jesus teachings. There's a little bit of this how some of us treat like maybe the what's called the Beatitudes or the Sermon on the Mount. You could sort of get there, and some people would argue that in the Q source there was probably a group of teachings that came together, and then the gospel writers broke those up and interlaid some narratives to make the teachings kind of make sense. Maybe that's the case, but if that's where it came from, that collection of teachings wasn't preserved. The thing that so we don't have that in our gospel in our Bible set. There's nothing in our Bible that is the collection of teachings of Jesus. We may have a dramatized version of the teachings of Jesus that are called the Gospels, but we don't have those. So even if someone wants there to be wants to argue, well, let's treat it as a teaching set. That's not the Bible that we have. That might be awesome. Maybe someone will find that thing someday, digging around in some cave somewhere, and that could be a real change. You know, but when you talk about dealing with the Bible in a healthy way, that's not what we're dealing with. And so, longing for that or recasting the Gospels as if that's what they're doing, we're really into something else. So and you wouldn't have a kind of Christian faith with a scripture set without the Gospels. Like they really anchor the thing, right? They're really the heart of it. So much so that the church decided to assign names and logos and all. If you've never looked this stuff up, the early church gave like a symbol and phrase and a design, a logo design to each of the gospels. They're kind of cool, actually. There's some different variations of them. So if you look at Mark, it's got its own little logo with a guy. It's almost like somebody would have a tattoo or something. It's so they thought very highly of them, but never thought to treat them in the way that what's happened in the Protestant church, a Protestant Christian church expression of the Bible, where the Bible becomes the replacement of the authority of the Catholic Church, and that the Gospels are the place where we're going to find the teachings of Jesus. So, what we should do is just return to the Bible and find the teachings of Jesus and then orient our faith around the teachings of Jesus. That would be great if that's what we could do. That's just not available to us. And I'm part of this group called Red Letter Christians, which is this group of people that try to say things to others to change the world. Um, and they're Christians of a particular ilk. And the people who organize this thing call it the Red Letter Christians. And the idea is, well, we take the red letters seriously, uh, which, that's a good notion. Because if you don't know what that means, the red letters in some versions of the Bible, the quotes of Jesus are put in red instead of black ink. So you can go, if you pick up a Bible and if it's got red in it, those are quotes from Jesus. So it's kind of pre-highlighted as the important statements. Um, you couldn't really have a more uh, ungospels thing to do to the words of Jesus from the Gospels than to highlight them in red as if they're free to function on their own. All of those quotes are in service of the gospel evangelists agenda of the gospel, right? They're not. That's why they're not the same. It's very hard to find exact replicas, one over the other. So there's this big agenda that's going on in there, and it leaves us then with a faith that's not oriented primarily around the teachings of Jesus, where we don't end up with a teachings of Jesus collection. Okay, all of that can be super destabilizing. Like, what the that that just seems opposite Friday, like Freaky Friday, for all the things that I was taught about the Gospels when I got into them. I mean, literally, I can hear myself saying things that are almost like I've put the word, like, I don't know what, there's some comedy thing I remember where kids would yell the word not every time someone would say something, right? Like it's knotting everything that I was told in my first few years of getting into Christianity. They were really trying to pitch, especially the Gospel of John, as if it was this repository of the truth that if I went there, it would all open and unfold for me. And then I would see it um, for its truth and everything. And then if you've read the Gospel of John or any of these guys, you're just like, I don't know what that means. And then someone says, well, in the original language, and now you're off and running, right? Because now someone's got you with, oh, well, there's a secret code in a language that you don't know. And if you can crack that code, then you've got it. Well, the Gospels don't want that to be the case. They're very common vernacular. It's populist stuff. It was designed in the first century to be accessible and to empower. The whole point of the Gospels being like this is that you would have life in the name, is that you would have a confidence in the story that you've been told, is that you would feel that you're part of the story, that you get dragged into it, and then you become one who has the story on your lips as you go. That's why the book of Acts is so interesting, because it sends the followers out into the world without a gospel in the backpack. They go with the gospel in them that they're telling, not pulling it out and pointing someone back. It's all interpreting the right now and pushing people forward, not designed to pull people back into some other teaching. And I think that's part of the reason why it can be so easy to read the Gospels and feel like the faith that we talk about now doesn't feel anything like this. Well, partly because it's a presentation, right? So it may not have even been as good then as it sort of is presented as. It's like the memory of the party is always better than the actual party, other than that one party where it was way better. Um, right, okay, all right. So we'll take a little break, and then we'll come back for some interactions and response and all that stuff, because that was 33 minutes of rolling you over. Okay, so we'll take a 2 or 3 minute, just sort of stand up, breathe break, bathroom break, drink a big glass of wine break, something like that.